Okay, guys, so I'm going to pick up. Hopefully, you followed my instructions at the end of the last video and went and watched the bystander effect video that's there. And I'd like you to think about, and then we could talk together about once we're online together, why you think this happens. Why is it that when we are in a crowd, that we are less likely to help somebody who's in need of our help? And I think that you can think a little bit about conformity. You could think a little bit about wanting or not wanting to stand out from the crowd. You can think about the idea that we feel a lessened sense of individual responsibility when we're in a crowd. But I think the conformity and the not wanting to stand out probably plays a big effect here. I think you also need to think about, again, if we think about our evolutionary history and what would have been true if somebody was in trouble 10,000 years ago. It probably was because something very bad happened, right? So an animal attacked them. If you stop and help, what is the likelihood that you're going to also then endanger yourself in some way, and that you might feel that you have to if you're alone, but that if you're in a group, you might hope very much that somebody else will endanger themselves more. When you look at the static slides, you can take a look at this link to the Wikipedia page on Kitty Genovese. But she was a young woman, or a woman, who was murdered in New York City several decades ago, many decades ago, probably 40 or 50 years ago. And nobody helped her. None of her neighbors who could hear her screaming helped her. And that's where we get the research from the bystander effect, is in response to that, because the whole country looked at that story and concluded that New York was a terrible place. The research since then shows that it's not a New York thing, that it is a people thing. Although we are more likely to see bystander effects in large cities, but that's because we're more likely to be existing in crowds and have a sense of anonymity in large cities. So the next thing I want to talk about is Zimbardo's prison experiment. Zimbardo is a famous psychologist. He is famous primarily for his Stanford prison experiment. And I would like you to already have watched that as well. And I think I've indicated that in the course materials. But if you haven't watched it yet, pause this, go into the course materials, watch that Stanford prison experiment, and then come back and resume this video. What's interesting about that, so once you've done that, right, is that experiment that the video talks about had to be cut short because both the prisoners and the guards adopted their roles too closely. Zimbardo's focus in that experiment is to prove the power of the situation to shape our behavior, and as opposed to stable personality traits. So his idea was that if he randomly sorted college students, male college students, into a prisoner or a guard role, if they were equivalent at the beginning, that he would get very different behaviors for those who were assigned the prisoner role or those who were assigned the guard role. And his experiment bears that out. And so it had to be stopped because they adopted their roles so closely that it was getting abusive. Interestingly, he also took on the role of warden, which is an interesting mistake he made, to not realize the power of the situation might affect his behavior as well. And it was a female graduate student who was walking by and watching video, actually of somebody who was locked in a closet, who said, "You need to stop this." And it was only until that point Zimbardo himself didn't notice, because he was so wrapped up in his own role. It also, in addition to the power of the situation to shape our behavior, it also looks at how likely we are to dehumanize other people. And so if you pay attention in that video to how each group is dressed, that their individuality is stripped away and they're just dressing in their uniform, so to speak. It's easy to see that experiment as being old, but some of you may or may not remember Abu Ghraib, which was a prison in the Gulf that American soldiers were running, and they did fairly terrible things to the prisoners there, mostly just as power plays, like not for any reason other than that they could. It's an interesting reminder that the prison experiment tells us some important things about human nature. Um, so I want to spend the rest of our time here, and certainly our class 2 online discussion will focus on this, thinking a little bit about prejudice. And we think in this country a lot about racial prejudice or racial bias, but prejudice really is any mixture of beliefs, emotions, and predisposition to action, or a likelihood to act in certain ways, that you have against another group, a group that you don't belong to. And so all of us have what is called in-group bias, and group bias is our tendency to think that people within our group are better than people outside of our group. Scapegoat behavior is when we blame people in other groups for problems that we're experiencing, and all of us are likely to do that. Whether or not you have racial prejudice or racial bias has to do with whether you define yourself by a group, right? Whether your sense of group belonging is defined by race. So if you're someone who, who defines yourself as being white or black, and those are important things to your sense of identity, then it's easy for you to see people who don't have that sense of identity, who aren't part of that group, as other, and you'll have in-group bias. And then you're also very vulnerable to scapegoat behavior. So I think it's always interesting to think about how we define ourselves. I think it's an interesting exercise. Then we can talk about this online maybe together a little bit to think about what groups do I think I belong to? Like, what are my identifying factors that I share with some other people that would make a group? So, if I thought about things, I could say that I'm an educator or a professor, right? I could say I'm a mother. I could say I'm a psychologist. I could say I'm a gardener. I think one way of thinking about this is if you showed up at a party and you asked somebody about themselves, somebody you didn't know, and so if I walked to a party and said to somebody, so what, so tell me about you, and they said, well, I'm a psychologist. I'd say, oh my God, I'm a psychologist too. And I would assume we had a lot in common, or at least a lot to talk about. Similarly, if I said, what do you do for hobbies? And they say, wow, I'm a gardener. I'd say, I'm a gardener. Tell me about your garden, right? And we'd have things to talk about, and we would see ourselves, at least in that moment, in that way, as being part of a group. And we might think, right, in group bias, that people who garden are better in some ways than people who don't garden. And that we might think that the problems of our environment are mostly caused by people who don't care about the natural world and don't garden and don't engage in the world in that way. That would be scapegoat behavior. And so there was an experiment carried out by a classroom teacher in the 1960s that I'm going to ask you to watch. And it's a kind of lengthy video. I think it's 20 or 25 minutes long. And I'm going to ask you to watch that. And while you're watching it, I want you to pay attention to the fact that she creates groups. That she creates groups of brown-eyed children and blue-eyed children, children who never had themselves separated themselves out into groups like that before that moment. But she creates those groups, and then I want you to watch what happens. I want you to look for that in-group bias that the children have, and also the scapegoat behavior that they engage in. And if you really have any interest in this, and it's a disturbing but really, really good movie, Hotel Rwanda. And Hotel Rwanda is about the genocide that occurred in Rwanda. The beginning of the movie is really interesting because the Dutch, who were the colonists of that part of Africa, when they showed up, they randomly separated the people they found there into two groups. And it really was very random. It was based on the length of their nose and the length of their neck and other seemingly random things that, it wasn't that they got there and there were already two groups of people who saw themselves as distinct groups. But they essentially did in Rwanda the same thing that this teacher did in her classroom with much greater consequences. And so if you're interested, Hotel Rwanda is also it's a fictionalized account of real events that shows, again, in-group bias and scapegoat behavior. So we'll talk about this more together online, and the thing I want you to do now is to watch that Eye of the Storm video. Okay, so go do that, and we'll talk online.